Sometimes if you have limited materials left, whether it be physical evidence or DNA evidence, you really have to decide, is now the right time to consume what you have? Or is it better to preserve it? Because if you think about what existed 5 years ago versus now, it's completely different.
Warning. The podcast you're about to listen to may contain graphic descriptions of violent assaults, murder, and adult language. Listener discretion is advised.
Welcome to the Murder Police Podcast. The Happy Face Killer's unknown victim, Patricia Skiple, Part 2 of 2.
We know as investigators, as we're getting closer and closer to our target, that eventually we will likely come across or possibly come across somebody who may know our victim. In this case, that's essentially what happened on one of the calls where I was speaking with somebody, inquiring with them because we had identified them as being the next closest target that we wanted to look at. This person started talking to me about a family member who actually told me about having 2 missing family members. I'm currently still in touch with this family member, but that was a pivotal moment in the case because I knew at that point that probably most likely my Jane Doe was one of these missing family members of this person. At that point, genealogy is not something that we use to conclusively determine a person is who they are. We usually like to separately obtain different DNA type sample of a known family member to confirm that it is in fact the person who we believe it to be. And that's what we did. In this case, I partnered with a detective, his name is Jim O'Connor from the Oregon State Police, to assist me with getting a sample from a family member to aid in the confirmation. Ultimately, we as law enforcement here don't make formal identification. The medical examiner coroner's office does that. Our Blue Pacheco was identified as Patricia Skiple on April 13th of 2022. That's just a few months ago when we finally were able to have the formal identification made. Our office, led by Sheriff Lori Smith, has always supported cold case investigations and has recognized the importance of really doing the right thing with these investigations, as has my direct captain, Dan Rodriguez. And my office really recognized the importance of traveling out of state to be able to tell the living immediate family members about what happened to Patricia. Earlier, I talked a little bit about my partner, Sergeant Noe Cortez, who was one of the people who helped me learn about cold case investigations early on when I started in the Major Crimes and Homicide Unit. And he accompanied with me out of state, and we went to Oregon and Washington State. Were able to drive to these different addresses and knock on the door of some of Patricia's siblings and one of her children and tell them what happened to their family member.
Well, that's great. Hey, real quick, hats off to the sheriff and the rest of the staff for taking cold case investigations and maintaining them, because we've talked a little bit on the show before with cold case investigations that when police departments face budget and personnel issues as far as people to be able to work on cases, in a lot of places, cold case investigation takes a back burner because it's looked at as something that's extra and doesn't compete with the things going on in the moment. So that's fantastic that your sheriff and your staff recognize that. And if you can, just because I don't want people to think you just picked up the phone and hit the lottery one day, any idea roughly how many calls or leads were followed before you got that one where it was like, I have this person I know of with 2 missing people? Any idea what the breadth of that time or that effort was?
It took so many targets to be identified. One of our analysts here, Rebecca Logan, helped me with some of the research on some of the targets. And I reached out even to some law enforcement partners in Canada who helped with identifying some targets. But ultimately, I would say hundreds of targets were identified. Each time those targets were identified, I called them each individually myself. And before we did the genetic genealogy, I probably couldn't even put a number of the amount of leads that prior detectives and just patrol officers had tracked down over the years. Hundreds.
Good. I just didn't, it's sometimes if people are listening quickly without paying attention, it does sound like you pick up the phone, you get that great news, you go to lunch and come back and get on the next one. And obviously this case, years of persistence like you talked about for sure.
Yeah. And it was so rewarding to be able to go out of state and talk with her siblings and her child. I feel anybody who has a career in law enforcement knows that there's a lot of rewarding opportunities. And over the years, I feel our office has given us a lot of rewarding opportunities. But being able to give answers to Patsy's family was something we were determined to give them. And several people just poured hours of dedication into doing that. That was remarkable. That's something that was very meaningful to me as a person and as a detective.
Did it strike them at all when you were talking to them about the idea that not only now do we know who she was, but that she fell victim to a notorious or well-known serial killer? Did they have any impressions on that?
Yes. One of the siblings was very disappointed to learn that he was a long-haul trucker because he actually had a high regard for long-haul trucking. That was very disappointing for him. Another sibling just had a hard time wrapping their head around not only has their loved one been missing for years, but something horrible happened, because there's a lot of people who are unidentified who die of natural causes, not necessarily homicide, and definitely not homicide or murder from a serial killer, and a very prolific serial killer.
Hey, Murder Police Podcast fans. The Murder Police Podcast now has its own merch and swag store. Go to themurderpolicepodcast.com and click the Murder Police merch store button now.
Ultimately, with one of the siblings, before Patsy went missing, Patsy's sister, Gloria White, which is one of the siblings who I went to talk to, Gloria White's own daughter, Martha Evans, disappeared in 1990, prior to when my victim went missing. If you can even imagine the torture of not knowing what happened to your sister, but also let alone your daughter as well, she's still living with wondering what happened to her daughter, and it's just awful. For Gloria, she was able to know what happened to her sister, and that was powerful for her to just have answers as to what happened.
That's unfathomable. Any idea on the age of her daughter when she went missing, when Gloria's daughter went missing?
Let's see. Martha goes by Marty. She was in her 30s.
Was it just kind of just disappeared out of the blue, like supposed to be somewhere and didn't show, or didn't make it back home after work?
My understanding is she attended a wedding and returned home, had a couple of emotional type phone calls, went to a gas station, and had a sibling who met her at a gas station and assisted her with getting the car to start. And that was the last time she was seen. She left the gas station and nobody ever saw her again.
We'll reach out to Gloria, because that sounds like a story that doesn't need to be suppressed in history either. I think the word needs to be out on that for sure.
Yeah, well, I think it's interesting how sometimes different cases that you work on have connections. And through working this case, I was able to connect with the detective on Marty Evans' case. And this case has been resolved. but it's also opened another opportunity for another open case to be heard again and looked at again, even though it has been reviewed and worked on for years and years and years, just like this one by that agency. It's interesting how the cases can connect sometimes and how these opportunities come along for you to forge relationships with other law enforcement partners.
Oh, for sure. Just through serendipity sometimes, I guess.
I had to weigh with my office what we as a whole thought would be best and what would we want if our family member, our mom, our sister had been murdered. I just couldn't fathom that happening over a phone call. It had to be in person. And is that something that you give a heads up for or something you just go try to do? And sometimes this job is just a combination of faith. And this is one of those examples where my partner, Sergeant Cortez, and I, when we flew out to Oregon, knew that when we rented a car and drove to these different residences that we thought were where each of these siblings lived and in Washington State, where these family members live, that hopefully they weren't going to be on vacation and hopefully they were going to be home or not at work when we stopped by. But my office took these notifications very seriously. Like I told you, we formally identified her on April 13th, and we flew out to Oregon the very next day, April 14th, as soon as we possibly could. It was like a leap of faith being able to go to these different addresses and literally knock on the door and hope that they were going to be there to answer when we got there. And fortunately for us, we hit the jackpot with that. Of course, under very sad circumstances did we have to meet each one of them, but they were all lovely and so grateful to hear what happened in person, face to face. They all were home. In that sense, it all worked out to where we were able to meet with each of them in person.
I guess they had just maybe formulated in their own minds what happened to her, whether it was they suspicioned it was a murder, or maybe they thought maybe she just decided to start another life somewhere else. Did they tell you that they kind of felt all along that she was a victim of something like this?
There were different sentiments expressed, including that they just had no idea what happened to her, that she was here one day and then all of a sudden wasn't. Gloria did express, that's her sister, that she knew as soon as I got there that I was there to tell her about Patsy. And I'm not sure if it's because we had a phone conversation before or not, but she knew that that's what I was there to tell her about. Her other sibling, one of them, just had no idea what happened and said, essentially, I'd see faces and sometimes think, oh, that's her. No, it's not. Been living with that for years. Always kind of looking for her. Always hoping to find her.
And this may be out of sync too a little bit. Did you ever locate a real missing person report for Patricia Skiple that was on file from the year she disappeared?
She was never formally reported missing.
Because it actually happens, even to this day.
Yeah, it's very common for a lot of different reasons. Sometimes, and it's a different time too. There's a different awareness now in 2022 of the availability for reporting family members missing or for making missing persons reports than there was a long time ago. And especially if somebody thought that someone was going to come back, maybe they were never reported missing, but thought at some point somebody else within their family did. There's a lot of different reasons that can be the reason why somebody wasn't formally reported missing.
Absolutely.
How many children did Patsy have? I know you mentioned you met one of her children.
Patsy had 2 children.
Now, was she married as well when she went missing?
So Patsy had 2 children and she was previously married. She was not married at the time.
So I guess maybe were some suspicions that ex-husband had something to do with it, or was it not that kind of relationship?
My understanding is that was not ever a suspicion, that nobody thought that.
Did you get a chance to learn anything more about who Patsy was on her personality, what she did, was there any kind of disclosure about what her life was like before she went missing?
Yeah, my understanding was that Patsy grew up in a really loving family that had two really hardworking parents, and there were several siblings and fun family celebrations, and that she loved being a mom to her two children and enjoyed the family.
That's good to know. That's another thing that happens with time, is that all of that personal stuff just goes away as well.
Yeah. It looked like when she was little, based on some of the photographs that the family shared with me, that she liked to spend a lot of time with her family doing things outside and outdoors, playing by the water, things like that. So Patricia right now would be 74 years old.
Wow.
At the time that she went missing again, she was either 44 or 45 years old when she was found. Currently, if she was living and here with us today, she would be 74. Both of her children were grown.
So shifting gears now onto her murderer, you did say he was a serial killer, as there's some documentaries of people may know the happy face killer, but Keith Jesperson, what can you tell us about him?
Keith Hunter Jesperson was really active in the 90s with his killings. He has claimed to be responsible for several murders, but there are 8 that are confirmed. Let's see. He had 3 kids. I'm just trying to think about what I can remember. He had 3 children. He was divorced. There was a lot of media attention around that one case that I mentioned, where there was kind of that false conviction for somebody who claimed one of his homicides. And really, if that hadn't happened, who knows if we would have known that he was responsible for ours, because really that was the beginning of him wanting to claim responsibility for not just that murder, but other murders that he had committed.
That is a stroke of fate, for sure. I don't want to say luck, but, to have were they false confessions or just false convictions? What were they?
Yes, it included a false confession. It did include a false confession.
That would get his pride up then, right? That's a little different than putting somebody in jail accidentally, but if somebody's bragging about your work, I guess he probably took that personally, maybe.
That case is like a really interesting case to read about.
Yeah, I was reading up while you all were talking about cold cases. I was reading on him, and it actually talked about that, how he confessed for that and then drew the first smiley face on the letter, and then how it wasn't his case. It was actually a pretty good read. And he's a tall guy, 6'8", it said. So he's
a big man,
big guy.
Mm-hmm.
So is he still alive?
Yeah, he's still alive right now. He is still in the Oregon State Penitentiary. He is currently serving life without parole there. Like I said, he has 8 confirmed homicides, but has claimed more than that.
Which I think is pretty typical of him in a lot of cases.
Yeah, it actually said he claimed 155.
I just think about my time in the Bureau. I started in 2015, and then between then and now, I rotated out for 1 year. It's just interesting how fortunate I've been to be at an agency where, I mentioned with you guys 3 cold cases that have been untangled and resolved. And 2 of those cases, including this one, involved a serial killer. That's unique to have that opportunity to be able to provide some answers for families, for 3 families in such a short period of time.
Very rewarding, like you said, for everybody. I mean, there's so much benefit from that.
It's interesting talking about it with you guys, because it's like I don't usually think about all of the little things that accumulate to this one big ending. It really was a series of small steps over a long period of time that got to the conclusion where Blue Pacheco finally was given her name back. And I just think that that's the goal. That's what drives these cold that are actually open cases to keep being pursued, because those family members deserve to know what happened to them. I think another unique thing about my agency is that we have our CSI in-house. A lot of agencies don't necessarily do that. They either have a crime lab that assists them, which ours does on occasion, but our CSI is in-house. So our CSI members, we're involved in all the processing. And so that gives, I think, our investigators who have that CSI experience like a unique perspective when we're looking at cases, considering the different types of evidence, because we have great familiarity with what the current processes are that can be used. And that, I think, played a role in benefiting me in this case as well, that my agency gave me the opportunity to work on CSI before working in homicide.
Just have that cross knowledge for sure.
Yeah, it makes a big difference when you kind of have all the different perspectives to be able to consider what you're going to do with what. Because that's another thing that's interesting about these older cases, is that sometimes if you have limited materials left, whether it be physical evidence or DNA evidence, you really have to decide, is now the right time to consume what you have? Or is it better to preserve it? Because if you think about what existed 5 years ago versus now, it's completely different. So I would also imagine 5 years from now versus now, there will also be better, improved options, especially for DNA. So on some of these older cases, when you have physical evidence items or just DNA, if it's pretty deteriorated, sometimes it's better to wait rather than to consume it right now.
Big decision. Yeah, a big decision. You know, as DNA was evolving, that our argument started, is especially in the early days, where you look at when you took, before PCR, when you had to have very large, comparatively very large pieces of sample. I remember court hearings, where even a defense and a prosecution may disagree in a moment over, well, we want to do it now, but the same thing you're saying is that, well, if we consume it, we don't get the benefit from anything that could be right around the corner. And it has grown at lightning speed. Well,
definitely. It's really interesting to me that my career has a lot of inclusion of DNA and just how things are unique with each person. My littlest son, he actually has a rare disease. It's called pediatric mastocytosis. And it's just really interesting because for his disease, that's something that I've worked really hard to raise awareness about his disease, and then also to raise funds for research for his disease. But it's just interesting how, again, you can take these small little steps and then end up having these really big outcomes that can be meaningful for so many people. And I find that to be true amongst the families within the pediatric mastocytosis community. And then that kind of mirrors kind of how I feel like myself and a lot of my coworkers conduct themselves here in the office. It's like we know that all these little small steps can end up having such a big outcome for so many people, just so far beyond what our limited scope or interest is within what we're working on.
It takes a succession of people with a lot of humility that we always talk about, right? That are in it for the right reasons, that check any kind of ego and put it aside, knowing that this thing that feels simple today or doesn't feel like can make a huge difference, instead of if you had somebody who was egotistical that they wanted to hold all of the facts or not release some or whatever, or get jealous. That's rare, but it still happens every now and then.
Yeah, it's so true, because you never know how these cases are connected with one another. You could be a patrol officer handling a stolen vehicle and collect something from that, and at the time have no idea how that relates to a homicide that isn't discovered for several months down the road later. And if that patrol officer hadn't taken that one step initially, that connection to the homicide would have never been made. So you just never know how whatever that small contribution is that you're doing is going to end up playing a bigger role in the bigger picture.
So true. Well, you never take shortcuts, right? You never take shortcuts. Everything is treated the way it should. If you had to give some advice to somebody that was thinking about going into cold case investigations or is just getting ready to start, and maybe even somebody that's doing it from their home, because it's becoming a more and more popular genre out there where people are doing internet investigations or whatnot. When it comes to working older cases, what kind of advice would you give to somebody that wanted to reach into the past like that? What are some tenets that you could give them?
If somebody were going to start pursuing an older case, I would suggest that they start by placing themselves in the time frame that the actual case began. And that doesn't mean just familiarizing yourself with who that victim was. It means all the people that are living within that case file. Making sure you do your best efforts to reach back out to everybody that was involved, whether it's other officers, friends, getting names of friends and family members that weren't included in that case file. And you basically need to make those cases live currently as they did back whenever the case happened. And at the end of the day, just remember the ultimate goal is that you're there for that victim. And many times in this case, who don't have their names, your goal is to give them their life back, even though they're deceased.
Excellent. Excellent.
Well, Kat, thank you so much for taking your time to join us on the Murder Police podcast and share with us this story of Patricia Skiple. I'm glad who now has a name associated with her horrendous murder. And thank you for the tireless effort you put into this case and to letting her be someone known, especially back to her family who was wondering all these years what happened to her.
There's just so many people that helped over the years and who contributed to the success of this case. I mean, even one of my coworkers who's a civilian, Juve Alves, who helped digitize everything. Again, just taking everything from 1993 and making it 2022 current. It's a whole evolution of all those small steps into something big. I couldn't be more grateful for my office giving me the opportunity to work on cases like this. Very fortunate at work and in my personal life with my family. So very grateful.
Yeah, excellent work. And again, in acknowledging the team effort over decades that everybody plays a role in that it's a long-term stretch for that. Well, for sure. Thank you, too, for taking the time. Good to hear and see you again. It had been months since I'd been out on the West Coast and with you all in your group that day. But it's always good to bump into you again. Thank the sheriff again. Pass that along for letting us borrow you for a little over an hour. We're very grateful to her
of course,
for getting that message across, because we can't do that without the support of our bosses, no doubt, for sure.
Definitely.
The Murder Police podcast is hosted by Wendy and David Lyons and was created to honor the lives of crime victims, so their names are never forgotten. It is produced, recorded, and edited by David Lyons. The Murder Police podcast can be found on your favorite Apple or Android podcast platform, as well as at murderpolicepodcast.com, where you will find show notes, transcripts, information about our presenters, and a link to the official Murder Police podcast merch store, where you can purchase a huge variety of Murder Police podcast swag. We are also on Facebook, Instagram, and YouTube, which is closed caption for those that are hearing impaired. Just search for the Murder Police podcast and you will find us. If you have enjoyed this podcast, please subscribe for more and give us 5 stars and a written review on Apple Podcasts or wherever you download your podcasts. Make sure you set your player to automatically download new episodes so you get the new ones as soon as they drop. And please tell your friends. Lock it down, Judy.